Thanks for convening this extremely important panel on a momentous date. This is the anniversary of the criminal U.S. invasion of Iraq. I think it actually took place on March 20th, but tonight was the night of shock and awe. And that assault was preceded by a shock and awe level propaganda about Iraqi WMD. And a previous assault on Iraq was precipitated by propaganda cultivated by many of the same forces that we've been discussing today about Iraqi forces taking Kuwaiti babies off incubators. It was all proven to be false. 1 million dead Iraqi civilians later. Today is also around the same date that NATO commenced its criminal assault on Libya, transforming a prosperous and stable, fairly secular country into a failed state that is the site of open-air slave auctions and continuous sectarian militia warfare. And that war was justified on the basis of humanitarian interventionist deceptions conceived by many of the same people who are now carrying out the Biden administration's foreign policy. We heard about Gaddafi's troops being given Viagra to carry out mass rape, which sounds familiar in the current environment, and a planned assault on the city of Benghazi by Gaddafi's army that would have led to a massacre. Both of these claims were blown out of the water, not only by Harvard's Belfer Center, but by the British parliamentary inquiry on the Libyan invasion. Libya, Iraq, these are formerly stable states that are now in disarray. And make no mistake, that is exactly what the United States and its allies would like to do to Xinjiang and would like to do to China. And that is the point of these humanitarian interventionist deceptions, which are being deployed and advanced by many of the same people who presided over the assaults on Libya, the proxy war on Syria, the destruction of, or the coup in Ukraine, which has turned Ukraine into a almost mirror reflection of Russia in the 90s, where Russia saw 3 to 5 million excess deaths. Now, we have to learn these lessons. We have to learn the lessons of history in order to understand what is presently being carried out, what the project that has continued from the Trump administration into the Biden administration, what the end goal is, why it's so dangerous. And this is what motivates me to be here. It's what motivates our journalism, our investigative journalism at the Grayzone, is to help the public better understand what's being done to them and how they are being manipulated. And so I owe a lot to colleagues like Ajit Singh, Ben Norton, Dan Cohen. There are so many others who've been contributing, Danny Haifong, Carl Zah, who've been contributing their knowledge and abilities to help public better understand what is happening here, because there is a narrative being constructed which is leading us straight to a hostile confrontation that could prove destructive on a civilizational level. Now, we're talking about Xinjiang and the accusation of genocide, which has been carefully constructed over the course of about the past 3 years. And it's been constructed through 3 methods. The first would be document leaks, so-called China cables, which paint a picture of a dystopian surveillance state, repression, but fail to approach a portrait of genocidal cultural destruction or the destruction of a people. The second method is exile testimonies. We hear so much from exiles like Tursunay Ziawadun, who was first cultivated by a Kazakh group, which is has close ties to the US State Department, and then sent to the United States by one of the affiliate organizations of the US government-sponsored World Uyghur Congress, where she then proceeded to change her story and make it much more inflammatory. It went straight to CNN. These testimonies remind me a lot of the North Korean defectors who are paid large sums by South Korean intelligence to paint a portrait of North Korea as this living hell where essentially genocide is being committed, and many of them have been revealed as fakes. And then the third method is studies, supposedly academic studies, which are unimpeachable. And that's what I'm going to focus on here in my presentation and go through it as quickly as I can because I don't have a lot of time. And the main studies that we have seen conveyed through mostly corporate media uncritically without apparently any hint of scrutiny or fact checking have been produced by 4 institutions which center around one individual. One institution is the Chinese Human Rights Defenders, which, like the World Uyghur Congress, is also funded by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy, a CIA cutout founded by under the watch of Bill Casey's CIA during the Reagan administration. And I'll talk about their study in a second. We have the Australian Strategic and Policy Institute, which is known mostly for its basically putting this 19-year-old kid, Nathan Rooser, in a room and having him study Google Earth images of Xinjiang to look for proof of so-called concentration camps, which often turn out to be elementary schools, warehouses, and common prisons. This is someone who has no expertise on China and is basically a shut-in computer geek who is just simply supplementing this propaganda campaign. And as Daniel pointed out, ASPI, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, is a hardline, very right-wing think tank in Australia, which is sponsored by the arms industry, by companies which actually themselves benefit from prison labor, by the British Foreign Office, NATO, and of course the US State Department. Not exactly independent research. Then we have what was supposed to be the first independent academic study by something called the New Lines Institute, which, as Ajit Singh reported 2 days ago at the Grayzone, is run out of a sham university, Fairfax University in Northern Virginia, which has nearly been shut down on 2 or 3 occasions. It's regarded as a visa mill. It looks like some kind of shell organization. And New Lines is basically a collection of regime change activists who have focused on Syria, former and current U.S. National security bureaucrats, including figures like Nicholas Harris, who advised the U.S. government to use wheat as a weapon against the Syrian civilian population, to occupy their wheat fields and starve the population in order to force the government out of power. These kinds of figures. Not exactly an independent institute, but the point of that paper was to basically secularize and legitimize the work of the one man who all of these studies tend to revolve around, and that's someone whose name is no longer unfamiliar to many of the viewers who are tuning in here, and that's Adrian Zenz. Adrian Zenz's name is present in virtually every Western media report on the horrors coming out of Xinjiang, either to verify these reports or to discuss his own reports upon which Associated Press and CNN reports are based uncritically, without scrutiny, and no fact-checking. Who is Adrian Zenz? Well, I actually was looking around last night for the first mention of Adrian Zenz in any media organization, and he didn't really surface until 2016. But then in late 2017, he started to become a household name for China watchers. Suddenly, he was an anthropologist and a figure who worked at a startup, a computer startup in Germany, who found a niche by writing studies, compiling various work tenders and Chinese statistical yearbooks, as well as public medical reports, to concoct this narrative of genocide, a narrative, I should mention, which he previously rejected until it became important for the State Department under Mike Pompeo to make the allegation. Zenz is someone who is very ideologically motivated to accuse China of genocide. His own views, which I would describe as fundamentalist apocalypticism and Christian supremacist, were outlined in a book he co-authored with his father-in-law, Marlon Sias, in 2012. It's called Why All Believers Will Not Be Raptured Before the Tribulation. And I asked Zenz during a meeting of the World Uyghur Congress and various US-funded organizations in the Capitol basement how these views affected and influenced his work on China, and he deflected. He refused to answer the question. You, in that book, call for spiritual spanking of children. You refer to gender equality as a satanic campaign. You speak out against hate crime legislation, and you speak out against tolerance thinking, blaming it on the leopard-like power behind the Antichrist. I was wondering how those views influence your work on China, a country that officially restricts apocalypticist evangelical religions like those expressed in that book.
Yes, thank you for this question. I do have a diverse background, and I have personal convictions, which I do not believe are inconsistent with my research. I do not support China's authoritarian methods in any way, and I do believe that there's a God who is bringing judgment in different forms. The end time is a very complex topic, a very fascinating topic, and I think very relevant. And I think it's good to live aware of that.
Zenz predicted that the future fall of capitalism would bring to power the Antichrist within a few decades. And he called the force that will usher the Antichrist into power the economic and financial fall of Babylon. Okay, this is the key expert on Xinjiang. Along with the fall of capitalism, Zenz views postmodern relativism and tolerance thinking and the apparent promotion of homosexuality, gender equality, and nonviolent parenting to be threats to Christianity and to represent the deceptive leopard-like power behind the Antichrist. Those are his words. Zenz has argued that hate crime and anti-discrimination laws will likely play a major role in the suppression of biblical Christianity. Again, his words. And that hate crime legislation forms part of an anti-Christian tolerance campaign because they forbid employers to discriminate based on gender or sexual orientations. Again, his words. He also calls, and ironic words in light of the wave of hate attacks targeting Asians in the West. I could go on, but this is someone who opposes gender equality, who presumably opposes birth control itself, and who's writing reports on China and its use of birth control, its poverty alleviation policies, and its socialist policies, who believes that socialism is satanic. He works for a foundation here in Washington that was set up with the support of the US government, which is funded by the right-wing Polish government, called the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which this year listed all COVID deaths, all deaths of COVID-19 across the world as victims of communism, because this foundation, Zenz's employer, blames China for all COVID deaths that have taken place all over the world. But when you see him referred to in the Associated Press, other media organizations that we're supposed to consider objective, none of this is ever mentioned. He's just seen as this wise, erudite scholar whose work is unimpeachable. Is his work unimpeachable? Let's just go through a few studies as quickly as I can, because I know I'm coming up on time. We have questions. His report on forced labor was significant in securing sanctions in the US Congress. And he claims that the Chinese government aims to force every Uyghur and ethnic minority into slave labor in order to eliminate their traditional culture. And to support this claim, he cites a mundane municipal government document. I mean, you see this throughout his reports that simply calls for achieving poverty alleviation. Xi Jinping announced the elimination of extreme poverty just last week, but he equates poverty alleviation and with forced labor. At the same time, he points to a free childcare program for workers in Xinjiang who are given jobs at factories as a way of inhibiting intergenerational cultural transmission and promoting intergenerational separation. However, nothing he provides in terms of what takes place in these daycare facilities supports his propagandistic claim. In fact, he cites a Chinese media report in which a mother describes how the child care services, in her words, solved my problem. Now there are people who take care of my children. I can go in peace to work. Very convenient. Words you might not hear from a mother who is working, a single mother working in an Amazon packing house in middle America. Nevertheless, Adrian Zenz denounces these programs as a shocking example of quote unquote liberation of women for their children. You see that propagandistic quality in his report, claiming over 1 million Uyghurs are detained in concentration camps. As Ajit Singh revealed, that report is based on a single report by Istiklal TV, a right-wing Uyghur separatist network based out of Turkey, I believe. But Zenz cited a report on that report by Newsweek Japan. Very shoddy sourcing. And I mentioned before, Chinese human rights defenders is also responsible for that estimate we keep hearing again and again, 1 million, 1.5 million in camps. It keeps going up to 3 million. They based their entire report on 8 testimonies, and they extrapolated the population of the village that each person who testified inhabited into that estimate. So that's what we've got there. And then finally, Mike Pompeo credits Adrian Zenz with allegation of genocide during a speech he gave. So along with Gareth Porter, I examined Zenz's paper. Many of Zenz's allies, his colleagues at the Jamestown Foundation, which publishes his reports, it's not an academic peer-reviewed publication, they criticized me and said, you focus too much on his far-right Christian views, which we agree are creepy, but you don't focus enough on his papers. So I said, okay, let's go into this paper. And immediately, any of you could do this, and anyone watching this can do this work. Go to the paper, read what he says, and then check his footnotes, and then look at the original documents, and you will wind up scratching your head, wondering where Adrian Zenz gets these claims from. Let me go through a few of them. Zenz cited a 2019 document from Wenquan County in Xinjiang as evidence of greater pressure to implement intrusive birth control methods. The whole point of this paper is that the Chinese government is forcing Uyghur women to take birth control in order to lower the number of Uyghurs. He points to a single mention in this paper of 468 birth control surgeries or family planning operations, provides no evidence that they were coercive, and then omits the next line, which expressed satisfaction with a birth rate of 8%, which is well over the national average in other prefectures and areas. And then he ignores the rest of the document, which is about increasing free mental health services, polio vaccinations, AIDS prevention treatment, and poverty alleviation measures, as well as new hospitals and medical clinics being constructed for the population of Xinjiang. Why would all that be taking place in an area where the Chinese government wants to commit genocide? It would be much wiser if you were going to enact a genocidal policy to do something like what Israel does to the population of the Gaza Strip, or what the United States is currently doing to the civilian population of Venezuela, which is to deprive them of basic goods, medical services, and simply let them slip into excess death. One of Zenz's major claims to me is absolutely shocking and was obviously overlooked by all the media organizations and the US State Department that conveyed his conclusions without examining the claims. And that was that 80% of all net added IUD placements in China were performed in Xinjiang, despite the fact that the region makes up only 1.8% of the nation's population. So what's going on here? It looks like on the surface, Zenz is saying that it's explosive that 80% of all IUD insertions are in this place that only comprises 2% of the population. In reality, if you look at his source, the 2019 China Health Statistics Yearbook, which we did at the Grayzone, and that's his only source, the number of new IUD insertion procedures in Xinjiang accounted for only 8.7% of China's total. So it looks like he was off by a factor of 10. When someone pointed this out, a critic of Zenz, he then said, well, I was just talking about new net insertions. I wasn't just cooking statistics. And so he basically calculated it based on new net IUD devices added minus those removed and came up with 80% of the national total in 2018. But he ignores that in other provinces like Henan, there were 206,000 new net IUD insertions. So that would have comprised 69% of the total in China. Hebei province, meanwhile, registered 61%. So if you combine all these, they amount to 210% of national net insertions. It doesn't make sense. You can't go over 100%. And then beyond that, these are provinces and areas that are populated almost entirely by Han Chinese people. So where is the specific focus on reducing the Uyghur population here? In fact, China's experiencing a problem in general with declining birth rate, as many other countries are. Then finally, I just can't help it. I know that I'm going over time, but I just can't help it. Adrian Zenz asserted that the Chinese government inserted between 800 and 1,400 IUDs per capita each year in Xinjiang. Per capita, that means per person, which means that every woman in the province would have had to have undergone anywhere from 4 to 8 IUD surgeries every day. With so much time on the operating table, how do they have time for the forced labor that he claims? It just doesn't make sense, and it shows how truly sloppy he is. Now, Zenz was called a fraud and fabricator at a Chinese Foreign Ministry press conference, which just yesterday, which sent the Western press in a rage. The Associated Press correspondent was especially upset, and he blamed us, which I was, a badge of honor. He blamed others, but what they failed to do at the Associated Press is what Zenz's own employers have failed to do, and what the entire Western media has failed to do, but which we did, which is to fact check him. And when Joshua Landis, who is a leading scholar on Syria in the United States, an actually academic, credited, peer-reviewed professor, promoted our story on Twitter, Zenz threatened to sue him. That's been his response, is to try to suppress this story because there's simply no response. I think what needs to happen here with these studies is to get out of the echo chamber of all of these fake experts and activists and ideologues who have been clearly recruited by the US government and its cutouts to push this hostile narrative, which is being used by the Biden administration as leverage for sanctions and hybrid warfare, and to subject Adrian Zenz to an actual academic peer review in an actual academic setting with actual China experts, scholars, and anthropologists and sociologists with diverse ideological background, and to actually fact check him. And then we might see the truth. Finally, in closing, I think the United States is embarking on a very dangerous path with these kind of allegations. They are seeking to promote ethnic strife in another country, something which the United States fears other countries doing to it. And the Chinese government would have a very credible case if it were to flip the script on the United States and accuse it of doing the same to Black Americans, considering that the president, Joseph Biden, played a direct role in the mass incarceration of African Americans, a program targeted at the incarceration of African Americans known as the drug war, something that Joe Biden ran on when he ran for Senate in successive campaigns.
Take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. Unless we do something about that cadre of young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure, without any conscience developing, if we don't, they will, or a portion of them will, become the predators 15 years from now. And Madam President, we have predators on our streets. They are beyond the pale, many of those people. Beyond the pale. And it's a sad commentary on society. We have no choice but to take them out of society. They are in jail, away from my mother, your husband, our families.
Let me quote Richard Nixon's former domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, who said that we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. The drug war, the genocide of Native Americans, the ongoing colonization of native land, the destruction of the Hawaii independence movement, the destruction of the Puerto Rico independence movement, the U.S. support for Israel's ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which is ongoing. All of this can be thrown back in the face of the United States if a government of a powerful country seeks to do so. And we saw that take place yesterday in Anchorage in the United States, and the American exceptionalists did not like it very much.
China is firmly opposed to U.S. interference in China's internal affairs. We have expressed our staunch opposition to such interference, and we will take firm actions in response. On human rights, we hope that the United States will do better on human rights. China has made steady progress in human rights, and the fact is that there are many problems within the United States regarding human rights, which is admitted by the U.S. itself as well. The United States has also said that countries can't rely on force in today's world to resolve the challenges we face. And it is a failure to use various means to topple the so-called authoritarian states. And the challenges facing the United States in human rights are deep-seated. They did not just emerge over the past 4 years, such as Black Lives Matter. It did not come up only recently. So we do hope that for our two countries, it's important that we manage our respective affairs well, instead of deflecting the blame on somebody else in this world.
This is what the U.S. is setting itself up for, and I think that all of us here would prefer a much more cooperative, collaborative path between nuclear powers, because we want humanity to continue and to flourish.